So the first question we would like to ask is about the state of analytic tradition in general. In The Realism with Human Face, you actually wrote that analytic philosophy in your mind is actually heading a crisis or in crisis already. So however, there are a lot of books written in analytic tradition. There are a lot of books appearing on, especially on the subject of consciousness. So, what is your perception of the state of analytic philosophy nowadays?
I think we may be coming out of the other side of the crisis. I think it's beginning to open up to people are changing their views. People are more uncertain about their views. More possibilities are being tried out, especially in this area of philosophy of mind and philosophy of consciousness. I noticed, for example, that Jerry Fodor and I used to regard each other very much as on opposite sides, but I noticed in many ways our views have converged through the years. I mean, he is like me, he is given up hard functionalism. Like me, he believes that I call myself now a non-reductive functionalist or a liberal functionalist. I believe that, I think you read my chapter in P. Grimm's book in which I say if our mental states are states, they are world involving or environment involving functional states. I call them functional states with long arms.
Right.
So I want to make clear that my rejection of functionalism is only a rejection of
it's 11 o'clock.
Computer machine. I didn't turn that off. Of computing machine functionalism, not of the idea that mental states are literally programs. But Fodor's also given that up, and he's also endorsed the idea that the reason that, namely, that I give, namely that psychological states, intentional states especially, I don't necessarily think that's the case with qualia, by the way, but with intentional states, I think that they are computationally plastic, that is multiply realizable in terms of programs, not only multiply realizable in terms of hardware. And that's a very important point on which we've converged. I understand that Jerry, he and Gerald Katz were my students at the same time, and I called them in those days the two Jerrys. Unfortunately, Gerald Katz died a few years ago, and I'm still missing him. But Jerry Fodor is also, I think, it sounds as if we disagree about intentional states, but in fact, what he says here, this is the over-influence of Quine on him, is there are no such things as meanings, and I say there are, but identity and difference of meanings is a matter of interpretation. It's not, there's this a scientific criteria. After all, are only science sense, but in that wide sense, I think that yes, the sameness and difference. Just too soft for Jerry, but I don't see a really metaphysical difference here. The metaphysical difference, I say there is such a thing as right and wrong interpretation. I'm sure in practice he thinks that too. When he tries to speak French. French isn't very good, but speak French. I'm sure he tries to get the translation right, the meaning right.
Right.
And so we're looking at the facts in not so totally dissimilar a way.
Okay.
But, yes, you're pondering what I say.
What you're saying is
so that, yeah. But it's all. Yeah. I can say a little more. It's not just a matter of Fodor opening his views, I think, and he like me changes his mind and tries out different things. I think that's the attitude when analytic philosophers wrote as if they hold that the years when analytic philosophers wrote as if they had all the answers, I think, are now behind us.
Okay.
What survived from analytic philosophy, Jerry doesn't even wants to even give up the term analytic philosophy. He published a thing, I think, in one of the British journals, maybe the London Review of Books, saying nobody's ever analyzed the concept. I don't give up the term, But I think that there's a dissatisfaction with the idea that analytic philosophy was a position. The idea of analytic philosophy as a tradition of respect for science, rejecting the idea of a sharp line between philosophy and science, that I hope will continue. But also in the field in which I work, one of the fields in which I work in many, and I'm too old to stop that. But one of the fields in which I work, as you know, is this area of consciousness and perception. And when I wrote in 1994 that no one was interested in philosophy of perception, except I mentioned McDowell and the disjunctivist, but that's changed very much. And the central theme of that book, of the threefold chord, mind, body, and world, that we need to see what was right in naive realism. Far from being now a point of disagreement among philosophers of perception, is now a majority view. The differences are about how to do it and what constitutes going too far in the direction of naive realism. But the idea that we went from, especially Russell was a great philosopher, but in the problems of philosophy, he went to the extreme of rejecting naive realism to such an extent that he painted himself into the corner of saying none of our perceptions are in public space. Everything we perceive is in what he called a private space. And then for the rest of his life, in all his writings on epistemology, he's trying to wriggle out of his private space. And I think we're seeing more continuity between analytic philosophy and so-called non-analytic philosophy. There's still people who are in the habit of assuming that everything that isn't by an analytic philosopher isn't philosophy at all, and there's similar old-timers on the other side. But I'm hoping that we'll pass that.
Hilary, returning to the, you said that analytic philosophy is against the sharp boundary between the science and philosophy.
Yes.
And in the chapter of the book that you sent us, you were also saying that it is perhaps time for science of consciousness. So does that mean that in fact the philosophical work, the preparational work for the science of consciousness has been already completed, and at the moment science has to take over the research, and it is a matter of empirical science to work out the details?
Definitely not. When I use the term science there, I'm using the term science in the very wide sense in which John Dewey used it, in which, of course, the social sciences are science, linguistics is a science, and so on. Not in the sense in which something is only a science if it resembles physics. In a paper in one of my volumes called The Idea of Science, I said, we've been torn ever since the time of Francis Bacon between two images of science. One image in which everything that has certain methodological virtues, it obeys the rules of what Habermas calls discourse ethics, it allows questions to be raised, it allows objections to be raised, it puts plus it's fallibilistic, it puts questions to nature. That we have a wide methodological notion of science, in which science is anything that satisfies certain epistemological criteria, which better be wide. And on the other hand, there's this idea that it's only a science if it resembles physics. And I despair of it ever ceasing to be the case, that we have two very different and in a way incompatible images of science. That's why I think in philosophy, the question is something really science is useless. Second, I think when philosophical questions are concerned, this was true throughout the history of physics, and I think as the study of mind, brain takes off, it will be also true there. In the history of physics, great conceptual questions were always discussed in each generation by both at least some philosophers and some physicists. Newton's Principia is full of philosophy. People forget that a lot of Principia is philosophical arguments totally demolishing Cartesian physics. Newton shows by careful analysis of Cartesian physics that Cartesian physics presupposes notions that it can give no account of. For example, if space is itself a sort of material, a plenum full of vortices, then even the notion of a direction in space is one to which the Cartesians are not entitled. This is analytic philosophy, and it's analytic philosophy at its best. And we forget, and I think there's an overemphasis on just a few philosophical ideas of Newton, his criticism of Leibniz's relativity. And one doesn't look at the enormous amount of philosophical analysis in Principia. This goes on and on. Kant, I was shocked many years ago when a Nobel Prize winning physicist said to me that Kant was the greatest astrophysicist in a 100-year period. And I said, why do you say that? And you talk about the Kant-Lagrange hypothesis. And he said, no, that was only a hypothesis. Kant showed by a very elegant geometrical argument that our galaxy, we live near the edge of a lens-shaped galaxy, not in the center of a spherical one, and that our galaxy resembles the Andromeda Nebula. I'd never heard of that. No philosopher ever told me that. No historian of philosophy told me that. I had two astronomers have since told me that. And then Weinberg, there was Stephen Weinberg, went on and said, Kant was the only astrophysicist for about 100 years who believed that star clustering could be accounted for by gravitation alone. This is so in Einstein's day, there's a volume in the Library of Living Philosophers called Albert Einstein, Philosopher Scientist. Einstein was a friend of my Doktorvater, my supervisor, Hans Reichenbach. And because of that, I actually got to meet Einstein once, because when I came to Princeton, when I was appointed at Princeton as a very young philosopher, 27 years old, I had a letter of introduction to Einstein from Reichenbach. And we had a philosophical discussion about quantum mechanics. Yeah. So I think first of all, philosophical question, the idea that all the scientists do is collect empirical data, this whole image of empirical data, and use the hypothetical deductive method, which isn't really a method at all. I mean, fundamentalists claim to be doing the hypothetical deductive method. I mean, what we're doing in science and philosophy of science at its best is trying to bring both conceptual analysis and new ideas, new scientific ideas, to bear on age-old problems, I would say. And I think that will continue.
Okay.
But you need both training.
Okay, but let's return to the beginnings, your beginnings. Tell us, please, about origins of your functionalism. How did you come to the idea that consciousness is something like a program?
Well, I was probably the first philosopher in the world who, in the intermediate logic class this was back in 1953, I taught logic. I was hired at Princeton when they lost a logician, John Kennedy, and they lost Adolf Grünbaum, the Princeton department was very weak there. He had very little company at Princeton, moved to Lehigh University. So I took over as philosopher of science and logician, because I was both a mathematician and a philosopher, at Princeton in 1953. I taught the basic symbolic logic course, which I think was the first. It was for juniors and seniors, the middle level logic course, and I taught them about post-canonical systems, which are a variant equivalent to Turing machines, and I taught them a version. So I was teaching students in philosophy about programming from 1953 on, before there were, outside of a few laboratories, before there were, or the basement of MIT, before there were really computers in the world. And my field in mathematics in those years was recursion theory and decision problems. So with someone with that training, so I didn't think about philosophy of mind apart from, as I mentioned in the P. Grimm article, I was concerned to refute an argument called the grain argument. I think it's a variant of the knowledge argument that, when I look at the sky, the blue I see has a different grain. It's continuous from processes in the brain, which aren't continuous. Therefore, the sensation, the quality of blue, the qualities of the phenomenal character of my perception of the sky cannot be identical with anything in the brain. That was a popular argument. I think Richard Brandt believed that argument, various people. I forget who I first heard it from, but it was, and it seemed to me, one, a silly argument, and secondly, it seemed to me that it confused that the knowledge argument in particular, although I didn't know that name then, I don't think the term had been invented, the knowledge argument in particular is the argument that when I learn what something feels like, when I actually experience red, as opposed to having been told that there's such a color, and maybe told it's physics, there's some knowledge I have, and therefore there's irreducible phenomenal knowledge, and then the step to it can't be knowledge of anything physical. It seemed to me that I thought, because I was used to thinking about Turing machines, and that, look, a Turing machine could give us the same arguments. But the argument really turns on is the difference between knowing about something by exemplifying it oneself and knowing about it by having a theoretical description. That's an inevitable dualism, if it's a dualism, even for, the robots like Commander Data in Star Wars. And it does. If it's a kind of dualism, then it's a dualism that a materialist should be able to live with. So that was my beginning of and then I got an invitation from Sidney Hook to talk at a conference on minds and brains in 1960. And that's where I wrote Minds and Machines. And I naturally, as again, building on my mathematical expertise, which was in Turing machines, developed this theme, that Turing machines could be a model for the mind further. Although I didn't definitely advocate it in Minds and Machines, I raised it as a possibility. Mm-hmm. But then afterwards, I went on to advocate it for a number of years.
But can you clarify your view about the identity theory? Can you agree with it in some kind of another of identity theory?
Yeah.
Can you agree with it?
One thing I believe, and I think I may have been first pointed out, is the one thing that happened in analytic philosophy, because of the attention to one kind of logic, basically the logic of Russell and Whitehead and its various offshoots, the idea of a property became fused with the idea of a concept. Russell actually had a third notion. He had the notion of a propositional function, which sort of disappeared. But basically, it struck me because one of my hobbies all my life has been classical philosophy. I, alas, did not study Latin very much, but I did study Greek, and I've read Greek philosophy in the original. And it struck me that for Aristotle, for example, universals were not concepts. And that fit in with since I was teaching philosophy of physics, trained by Reichenbach, and I was hired to teach it at Princeton. Since I was teaching philosophy of physics every year at Princeton, also when a physicist discovers that light is electromagnetic radiation, he hasn't discovered the identity of two concepts, but he has discovered that a universal he knew in one way, as electromagnetic radiation, is identical with a universal we were acquainted with in a different way, that there is such a thing as a synthetic identity of properties, or physical magnitude, physical magnitudes being a paradigm case of that. And then I came to see that we need that, if we're going to defend the idea that mental states could be identical with brain states, which I still think may be the case with qualia. I agree with Ned Block has convinced me, and I think Sidney Shoemaker and so on, and I think I said that even in Reason, Truth, and History, the chapter on mind and brain, that when it comes to the qualitative aspect of experience, that may well be identical with something in the brain. And again, one has to see that, yes, that seems shocking because we are acquainted with our own mental qualities by exemplifying them ourselves. This is the question of the knowledge argument again. And whereas any complicated brain state that we are described in neuroscience will be acquainted with via a theoretical description. But it's a prejudice, but it's a philosophical prejudice, a prejudice inherited from this narrowing of from logic, from the fact that logic didn't distinguish between physical magnitudes and concepts, that they can't be identical. So I do believe that there's this thing as what I call the theoretical identity of properties. And I wrote a paper called On Properties, in which I defended that. And I still believe that that's, otherwise you're just forced to all kinds of dualisms, simply because you'll say, well, wherever there are two concepts, you'll have to say that wherever there are two concepts, there are two properties. And I think that's a bad metaphysics.
Mm-hmm. But let's suppose that qualia are indeed identical with some of other brain processes.
Yeah.
But how is it possible to verify this identity? Do you think it is possible to verify, or it makes no sense to ask about verification?
No, I think much verification in science is holistic via the success of an explanatory picture over time. I would hardly say this is verified now, but for example, some of Ned Block's papers actually make hypotheses about which brain processes particular color qualia might be identified with, and he gives reasons in terms of both in other words, if you have a picture which unifies both the phenomenological data and the data which is coming in from brain science, that would seem to be a strong argument for saying that might be true. I resisted that for a number of years, but eventually as Block's papers have convinced me that that's right. But I would add one thing here. The real problem for me with qualia, in a way, is raised by John McDowell. John McDowell wants to say that, well, first of all, he would deny that there are such things as qualia, because he thinks he thinks we directly observe properties of external things. But secondly, although he's a little ambiguous about that, but secondly, he thinks that our what I would call qualitative perceptions, experiences qualia, are themselves conceptualized. I think for me, the questions which have really exercised me have exercised, I think his book, although I have disagreements with it, I think his book, Mind and World, now I think 15 years old or more, 16 years old, was a great book because it raised questions that I've been thinking about for all of these 16 years on the relation between concepts, percepts, and external things. In particular, McDowell's argument is that assumes what he calls minimal empiricism, which according to him means that experiences, which I think he sometimes uses the word impressions, and that indicates to me that he's identifying experiences with qualia, which I think building on Kant is a mistake. But once you identify experiences with qualia, what you say, my experiences are just my sensations, or sensation and experience are the same thing. And then the problem is, you're a minimal empiricist, as you say, experiences are the tribunal before which judgments have to stand. That translates into sensations, or qualia are the tribunal before which experiences have to stand. And then you have the problem that bothered Russell in 1909 in the Problems of Philosophy. How can qualia, if they're in my private space, how can I get from my qualia, which are all my ultimate evidence, to anything outside? I think so stated, the problem is insoluble. What's more, Jim Conant has drawn a very useful distinction between Kantian skepticism and Humean skepticism. Hume assumes that, of course, our ideas are right or wrong and argues how we know they're right, and he concludes we can't know they're right. But Kant asks, how do we know that our ideas of external things really are ideas of anything, as opposed to just a play of mental form, an empty play of mental forms. In a sense, that would undercut even Humean skepticism, that Hume is already not skeptical enough if Kant is right. And again, I think that problem, if you think that our ideas of external things are the same as qualia, which is, or even that they're not the same as qualia, but somehow they have to be justified solely by qualia, then I think that picture means the skeptic is right. Kantian skeptic is right, which means that we've gone wrong somewhere.
You said here, I quote, that having a functional organization of the kind humans typically have is all there is to having human consciousness, and that the familiar objections, like zombie argument, fail to convince you, you said. My question, why does zombie argument fail to convince you? Is it because that, as you once claimed, you believe that conceivability doesn't entail possibility? Why?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that I don't think that the it seems to me that I've never seen it. It seems to even people who think conceivability does entail possibility then want it both ways. They will say, well, in some cases, but not the right kind of conceivability. I don't understand. I don't understand how you tell which is the right kind of conceivability. I mean, look, there's a sense in which, all right, first of all, you have to put mathematics there, because there's a sense in which until Fermat's last theorem was proved, there's a sense of conceive in which I could have conceived that Fermat's last theorem was false. If I were unable to understand the proposition that Fermat's last theorem might be false, I couldn't, well, let me take another case. I worked. There's a hypothesis on which I myself worked, although it hadn't been named at that time, called P equals NP in computer science. That is, that whatever can be, if a program can be solved by a Turing machine, if an infinite class of yes/no questions is such that any one of them can be answered by a Turing machine, which is what we call a question being decidable. If it's decidable in polynomial time, the time required, say, is a polynomial function of the input data, then it can be solved. If it can be solved in exponential time, then it can be solved in polynomial time, P equals NP. Well, for some years, the consensus was obviously, though, that P can't equal NP. The problem is to prove that P does not equal NP. Now, some people, including myself, think, well, we don't know. We simply don't know. But actually, my first paper on that, which was the paper in which I presented now something called the Davis-Putnam Loveland algorithm for theorem proving by machine, that grew out of an attempt to prove in present-day terminology that P does equal NP. What we were hoping for was a polynomial time algorithm for deciding whether an arbitrary formula of propositional calculus is a tautology. And the best, we couldn't prove that, but the best we came up with. But I couldn't have, now whichever, since I've worked on both sides of that question, I've tried to prove that P does equal NP, and I've tried to prove that P does not equal NP, and have not gotten anywhere either. Or other mathematical questions. I worked for years on both sides of the question. Is Quine's system, New Foundations, is it the case that it's consistent relative to Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory? That is, can we prove that if Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory is consistent, the New Foundations is consistent? I've also worked on the opposite side. Can we prove that if New Foundations is consistent, then Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory is consistent? I and my students have gotten nowhere on that. But in some sense, in such cases, we understand one of those two propositions, if we assume bivalence, one of those two propositions must be mathematically false. In fact, if there's a proof, it must be logically false. But there's some sense in which you can understand propositions which are mathematically false, well enough to try to prove that they're mathematically false. You know what it is. So first of all, so mathematics, at least, conceivability does not entail possibility. Now one might say, yes, but if something is conceivable and not logically contradictory or mathematically contradictory, then it's possible. Okay, I want to say, why do you think that? That seems to be an awfully rich world of possibilities. That is, again, it's a collapsing of, I don't like the term metaphysical possibility, but to use Kripke's term, it's collapsing of the categories of metaphysical possibility and mere logical possibility. And I don't believe that they collapse.
But what about zombie? Can you conceive zombie or not?
I think the notion is incoherent. And again, for much the kind of argument that Saul Kripke gives in naming a necessity, if you ask, before we have thermodynamics, if you ask, well, can you conceive that heat is nothing to do with molecular motion? There's just a fluid. I think Kripke would say, and I would say, in one sense to conceive you can, but not a sense that implies that it's really possible. Because after you discover that what heat is, that there's an identity between this ties with our previous discussion about synthetic identity properties. Once you understand that the property of having a certain temperature is synthetically identical with the property of the mean molecular kinetic energy being so and so, you understand that when you imagine a world in which, say, matter doesn't even consist of atoms, there are no molecules, but somehow things feel hot to the touch, and people talk about heat, they're actually talking about a different phenomenon. You haven't conceived of a world in which heat has nothing to do with molecular motion. You imagined a world in which the word heat, the word temperature, and our mental associations with it all correspond to a different entity entirely. Now, I should say, qualify, when I said that having human consciousness just is having a human, sufficiently human functional organization, I don't mean that, say, I'm sure Commander Data was a figure in Star Wars, and whose commanding officer or one of the officers on his ship wanted to take him apart and destroy him just to study him because he's not conscious, he's a mere automaton. And there was a trial to decide whether Commander Data is really conscious, and he convinced them that he loved someone. And then they decide, so he's conscious and he was not destroyed. It's a wonder. People sometimes use that episode in courses in philosophy of mind. Now, my position is, yes, Commander Data was conscious, but I'm not saying his qualia were the same as ours. I don't think we can imagine Commander Data's qualia. But I think Sidney Showmaker has the same position, is that having qualia is a functional state. But the qualia themselves are not functional states, and I think that my best hypothesis is that they are physical states.
The phenomena you were discussing, describing, or the functional organization, is accessible through the third-person perspective, and the phenomena you were describing also have an access, objective access. But qualia seem to have an irreducible subjectivity. So, do you see any problem in that? Do you see a problem in privacy of the of experiential phenomena? Do you see there any problem?
I still stand by what I wrote in Minds and Machines, that the same subjectivity would apply to robots too.
And
that is
yes.
Ultimately, for a logical reason, there's a difference between exemplifying a state oneself and having a description of it, but that would apply to robots too.
And that's all. That's all. Yes. I mean that nothing in robots except this difference. and nothing in humans except this difference between two kind of states.
The description and the actual state. Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, well, I think as I say, I still believe there's another paper I wrote on that called "Robots, Machines, or Artificially Created Life." One of my early papers, in which one section is called "Advocate Civil Rights for Robots."
Mm-hmm.
And I expect if they're ever intelligent robots, I hope they'll build a statue to me.
Okay.
But what is the difference of your position from the position of David Chalmers? Can you tell us about your relation to him, to
His position.
his
Daniel.
position?
David Chalmers.
Well, oh, David Chalmers.
Yes.
I think, gosh, it's been a while since I don't know. I have not discussed these issues about Chalmers. I mean, so I don't want to try to, I would have to swat up on his position. I don't want to try discussing it from memory.
What about Dennett? What you were saying about intentionality and the environment, the way that intentionality is connects a system to its environment. Do you think that Dennett's theory of intentional systems is close to your position?
Except that I believe that, I think a lot of what I said he'd agree with, but I think that he his account of reference in real patterns seems to me open to millions of counterexamples. He does not, I think, have a plausible or robust account of what reference is. And I am always a scientific realist. I believe that our terms refer. I don't think I'm just, making a kind of, he doesn't want to bite the bullet. His position seems to be, and he says, very influenced by Quine. The two philosophers who influenced him in his training as a young man were Ryle and Quine. But I think Quine gradually got the upper hand because basically, like Quine, I think on Dennett's story, there is, there's only reference, and Branham, there's a lot floating around in analytic philosophy. There's always seemed to be a weird position. There's the position that words refer to things only relative to an interpretation or relative to a translation scheme. Now, I think that, unlike Branham, who I think is willing to go all the way to Quine or the Salarzians, at a certain point, Dennett asked himself, is that what I'm saying? And so, he says, there's this much objectivity. Somehow the patterns correspond. Yes. Mm-hmm. Only a metaphor. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's the point. It's on account of reference. Fodor, if you like, has the opposite problem from my point of view. Of course, each philosopher says this one is that problem, this one is that problem, from the Middle Ages on. But it's a good way to proceed. You try to sort out who's on your left and who's on your right, except I don't know which is left and which is right. So I would say Fodor goes too much in the direction of giving up intentional meaning and then settles but says, yes, but there is an objective notion of reference. Mm-hmm. Dennett, like Quine, I think, hangs on to intentional meaning, the opposite of Fodor, but he goes very soft on reference to the point where you don't think he really has an account of reference. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to say, words do have intentional meanings. I agree that they're not the sameness and difference of intentional meaning is a matter of interpretation. It's not sharp. But when Quine says no object, no entity without identity, my answer is, well, look, I know physics. Quine only gestures at physics. Quine didn't really know physics. And even in physics, I can show you there's no perfectly sharp identity. There's no precise definition of 1 second, for example. We redefine what a second is every few years. But it's not an infinitely precise notion. If you say the only notions we can take seriously in analytic philosophy are perfectly precise notions, I would say outside of pure mathematics there aren't any, and maybe not even there.
So let's go now to the reference, to your externalism, to your famous claim that meanings are not in the head, and of course to your twin earth thought experiment. In your papers, meaning of reference and meaning of meaning were the twin Earth was presented, you argued that intension of the term doesn't determine its extension. So in 1750, an intension of the term water was the same on Earth and on twin Earth, but their extensions were different because on Earth this term meant H2O, while on twin Earth it meant XYZ. It means that if somebody from our planet had visited twin Earth in 1750 and called that liquid water, he would make a mistake. If that is not a mistake, then the extension of the term water was much wider than you suggested. My question is, why such a visitor from Earth, visitor who is now on twin Earth, would not in 1750, would not make a mistake using the term people, for example, on twin Earth? If he used the term water in 1750, he made a mistake. Why did he make a mistake using the term people?
Okay, let me modify the example. When people raise the objection that, well, after all, human beings have bodies, which, first of all, I think the term people doesn't, as we understand the notion of a person, I don't think being a person requires having this same kind of body we do. But there's a problem there because I wanted them to have the same kinds of brains we do and the same brain states, so their brains would have to contain H2O and not XYZ, etc. Okay, so here's the modification of the twin Earth thought experiment. I think I used this in my paper, Meaning Holism, in Quine's, in the volume Philosophy of W.V. Quine. I've also reprinted that. You could imagine that, or maybe in any case, I like the following thought. I used it in classes. I think it's in one of my papers. But imagine that twin Earth water is actually a mixture of grain alcohol. See, I'm now going to have a variant in which twin Earth water doesn't even taste the same to us, but in which it tastes to them the way water tastes to us, just to bring out that was not essential to the twin Earth argument, that the superficial properties even be the same from our point of view. It's only that the superficial properties, and this is sort of a cross, this was an anticipation maybe of Ned Block's inverted Earth argument. So in my revised version of the twin Earth thought experiment, the water is really intoxicating on twin Earth, but they've evolved so that the alcohol doesn't reach their brains. Their brains are protected, right? They have brains like ours, and their bodies on the whole are ours, but there's some protective filter in the head which keeps in the bloodstream, which takes the alcohol out of the blood, so they're not drunk all the time. Now, in that case, there would be no question from our point of view that twin Earth water is not water. We wouldn't even mistake it for water. Nevertheless, it would still be the case that their brains would be in the states relevant to linguistic processing, assuming that we can make sense of speech center and which parts are relevant to linguistic processing at all. In the states of their brains relevant to linguistic processing would be when they use the word water, would be like the states in our brains when we use the word water, until they got too scientific and discovered too many things. But I'm assuming an early stage when you don't even have accurate thermometers yet. You don't 1750. I don't know. The thermometers came late. Originally, when thermometers first came in, they weren't calibrated. They didn't agree one with another. And then people didn't know that the boiling point of water is unique. Actually, water, we don't have any perfect definition of water in terms of quantum mechanics even today. But water is uniquely definable by its macroscopic properties. There's no other chemical compound with that boiling point and that freezing point. But I'm imagining an early stage when they couldn't tell water from certain mixtures. Even today, we can imagine if somewhere in chemistry, turns out there's some liquid which is tasteless and colorless but doesn't support life. Well, one such liquid, for example, is heavy water. Heavy water, if you drink only heavy water, after about a few months you'll die. But a mixture of 50% water and 50% heavy water will support life. And a layman would mistake it for water, but if you tell him that it consists of 50% of a liquid that is not a constituent of ordinary water and that won't support life, he would say then it's not water, it's a mixture of water and something else. So so I want to say the point I think in the twin earth argument is robust, and it doesn't depend on the science fiction. It can be made scientifically realistic.
Mm-hmm. But let's continue our discussion about water.
And gold. By the way, I learned the history of one of my colleagues at MIT many years ago in 1961 was a great metallurgist who wrote a great history, Cyril Stanley Smith, who wrote a great history of metallurgy, and in which he pointed out the idea of pure substance, which is what this, and I would say the notion of a natural kind, I'm not claiming that it's drops from heaven. I think for Saul Kripke, the notion of a natural kind and an essence just drops from heaven. But I'm talking about a notion that developed with science, and according to Cyril Stanley Smith, before science in metallurgy. About 3000 BC, the notion of a pure substance and the idea that one sample of a pure substance should behave like any other sample was already in place when Archimedes examined the question, is the king's crown really gold? If the word gold had meant whatever has certain superficial properties, they wouldn't have called in Archimedes. They would have just looked to see if it has those superficial properties. But they had the notion that something with those superficial properties might not really be gold. So in a sense, the beginning of the formation of the notion of the essence of a material, of a substance, begins with metallurgy.
Interesting. But let's continue our discussion, as I've said, about water. It seems, maybe not now, but it seems that you believed that while we can conceive that water is not H2O, still water is necessarily H2O. You agree with Kripke? It means
it's necessarily approximately true that it's H2O. but I believe in approximate truth because in theoretical physics, all we have probably is approximate truth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But anyway, it seems that you don't consider this proposition, water is H2O, as analytic. Yes? But how can you prove that proposition water is H2O is not analytic in our language community? How can you prove that this proposition is not analytic?
I don't understand the notion analytic unless you restrict it to very trivial examples, like all bachelors are unmarried, all foxes are vixens. And even those, if you press them, I think there is something linguistically special about this very small class. Noam Chomsky once said to me, I think there are only about 300 such words in the language. It was when philosophers tried to expand the notion of the analytic that they got into a lot of trouble. I'll give you, and that begins very early. I mean, there's expansion and the fact you get into trouble. But I think Locke, for example, claimed that his term was trifling truth. He didn't have the analytic as a concept term, but there was a trifling truth, a verbal truth, we would say, involving any concept. It was a very interesting claim. And his example was, take, for example, the concept hedgehog. It's a trifling truth that a hedgehog is not a star. And then I thought, is that really an analytic truth? Couldn't I imagine that stars turn out to be glowing hedgehogs? Is that ruled out by the very concepts? And I had a discussion with Saul Kripke many years ago in which I said, well, Rogers Albritton, a colleague, a beloved colleague now, no longer alive, for many years at Harvard and then later at professor at UCLA. But Rogers said, well, maybe it could turn out that pencils are artifacts. We examine them under electron microscopes and we find the nerves. you'd have to find out how they sexually reproduce and so on. But, I very rarely bought pencils. So for all I know, they just do reproduce in the offices overnight. So Kripke and I were walking. I think he's forgot this conversation. He didn't remember it, but I think he said something very interesting. I said, well, could it turn out, I consider the statement that tigers are not glass bottles. This is my modification of Locke's stars are not hedgehogs. And I said, well, suppose we first apply Rogers' technique and we imagine that glass bottles turn out to be organisms. Mm-hmm. Then we find out that tigers are the form that glass bottles assume when they're frightened. Mm-hmm. And Saul said instantly, and he's later forgotten, but he was clearly applying some of his ideas in modal logic. He said, well, you haven't shown that it's possible that tigers are glass bottles. You've shown that it's possible, that it's conceivable. You've shown that it's possible. You haven't shown it's conceivable that tigers are glass bottles. You've shown that it's conceivable that it might become conceivable. In other words, a modal logic in which diamond P is not the same as diamond P. And I think it's a beautiful move. I think there are a lot of things where I would like to say they're not conceivable quite, but it's conceivable that they could become conceivable. But in any case, the notion, is it analytic? Clearly, these examples are enough to show that tigers are not glass bottles, stars are not hedgehogs, are not analytic the way all bachelors are unmarried are, or all vixens or foxes are. But even those, Charles Travis recently raised the following question. Once you go externalist, you get a line of suspicion about the analytic, which is different from Quine's, from a different direction. Charles Travis, a philosopher at King's College London, American by birth, raised the following example. Suppose a paradigm, in a sense, all vixens are foxes is female, or vixens are female foxes, a priori vixens are foxes, and all vixens are females, are analytic sentences because they're paradigms of analytic sense. So they're a case of what I call a one criterion concept, a word which is defined by the conjunction of two other words. But Charles said, look, suppose it turned out that, contrary to what we thought, foxes reproduce asexually. So there are no females. But there are two kinds, and one kind, the cute kind, raises the cubs. So that's the kind we call vixens. So that might be a case in which it turned out to be false that all vixens are female. So once you begin suspecting the notion of the analytic, the idea that that's a notion that can do any work in philosophy at all seems to me to vanish. That, I think, was right. Quine's, I think, demolition job on at least the overblown use of the analytic, the attempt to use the notion of analytic to claim that there are analytic propositions whose analyticity solves any philosophical problem at all. I think he was right to reject that.
Mm-hmm. So what your position is? There are no analytic propositions, or your position is that it is senseless to talk about analyticity?
Well, I would define, it ain't necessarily so, which I still pretty much stand by. I propose defining analytic to try to capture what the propositions I think Kant would have classified as analytic as first what I call one criterion concepts. These are the cases of where you start with a word which is synonymous with a conjunction, like a bachelor is an unmarried man, or a man who's never been or a vixen is a female fox, right? So you call these analytic. And then I think Kant would have also wanted to count anything you could derive. I propose this as a tentative rational reconstruction because Kant didn't know about later logic. But in order to capture the idea that analyticity is decidable, which I think is part of Kant's notion, you might then go on and say analytic propositions in the sense of these definitions of the one criterion concept, plus the closure thereof under monadic logic, not full predicate calculus, but monadic predicate calculus, which is decidable. That would give you a class which I think but that doesn't quite work because of what I pointed out in the meaning of meaning. You would have to exclude, or I'm sorry, already an innate necessary. So, but you had to be careful to say, when you call something a one criterion concept, the reason I said one criterion is it must not be a term which has theoretical definitions in a theory, because such terms then acquire multiple loyalties. A term, even though you might say at one time, by momentum, I mean the product of mass times velocity. When special relativity came along, we discovered that momentum, even within a reference frame, even within holding a reference frame fixed, saying I'm using the, Arlington, Massachusetts as for a reference frame in which Arlington, Massachusetts is at rest, not, say, a reference frame on the other side of the Earth, which is moving, 50,000 miles an hour relative to it. Even in a fixed reference frame, momentum is now mass times velocity plus a small relativistic correction, which becomes very big when the v approaches the speed of light. And and the point of it ain't necessarily so is we're still referring to the same magnitude. We were wrong about its exact value, and we could be proved wrong about it because it was what they called a law cluster concept. Momentum appears in a whole cluster of exact laws, which were all revised at once. In fact, one of the things about the theory of relativity, which isn't written enough very much, is that it's the first example I know of a sign. Maybe there's such well, I should be careful. Maybe there's such examples in ancient relativity theory, but that a law of nature must be invariant under Lorentz transformation is a meta law. It refers to all laws of nature, not just laws in a given list. And then we use that law to correct other laws, so that it's important that Batchelor and Vixen and terms like that do not appear in exact laws. They are not law cluster concepts. So I would say there is an attempt to say, yes, there's something linguistically different. Momentum is mean molecular, is the product of mass times velocity, always was linguistically different somehow from a vixen as a female fox. And I was trying, and it ain't necessary so, to analyze that difference.
Mm-hmm. Let's now discuss your another famous thought experiment, brains in a vat. According to you, if we were brains in a vat, we could not correctly say we are brains in a vat because our words refer to illusions, not to real things. And in a world of illusion, we are not brains in a vat. Hence, that proposition would be necessarily false. And this means that while our existence as brains in a vat doesn't contradict natural laws, it's impossible all the same. But look, when we dream, we exist in a world of illusions which we mistook for real things. However, sometimes, while in a dream, some people can realize that they are dreaming. And they say to themselves, we are dreaming, we are brains in a bed. And this is a true proposition. So what is the difference between these propositions? We are brains in a vat and we are brains in a bed. And why one of them is necessarily false and another could be true?
Okay, there's a lot of background to this. First of all, I don't say all brain in a vat scenarios are inconceivable. For example, my argument does not exclude the following possibility. I am invatted tomorrow without knowing it. Or maybe all human beings are invatted tomorrow without knowing it. But on my view, we still have concepts.
It's 12 o'clock.
I should have turned off the clock. We should have, this to give some verisimilitude. Yeah. if you leave it in. Well, we still have concepts because our words have acquired certain external reference already. And the mere fact that I'm deceived as to where I am doesn't deprive my words of their present reference. So that, in a sense, my argument doesn't really give as much comfort as it might seem, because someone who may worry that he's been invaded after acquiring some public language, French or English or Russian, cannot say, well, Putnam has shown that that's not possible, because I don't claim that. I'm only excluding something which is really a version of the Descartes possibility, that the whole show never was as I imagine. It's the Matrix scenario. As someone said in the New Yorker, I was the first person to think of the Matrix scenario. They're putting all sentient beings in the illusions. So that's a very different illusion. So, and the dream case is like the case of being invaded yesterday. I wasn't right. My words have acquired sense and reference, and they keep that sense and reference even if I'm dreaming. So that would be the answer to your question. Now, on background, a little bit of background may be interesting. I see a change coming about here. Descartes' argument, evil demon argument, shows that he's no Aristotelian, right? For Aristotle, concepts or forms, because as I say, I think the distinction between concepts and properties is post-medieval or certainly post-Aristotelian. The concept there are universals and particulars, which should not line up with modern predicate calculus and the philosophy that goes with modern predicate calculus. But for Aristotle, forms have to be acquired from things which have them, at least in the basic cases. So that Aristotle is, if you like, a kind of externalist. This is not Descartes, however, is convinced that even if there were no external things, say if I were a disembodied spirit and the evil demon were a disembodied spirit, there were not any such things, I could still conceive of them. I would say Descartes imagines we are, in my jargon, semantically omniscient. I'm semantically omnipotent.
Yeah.
Semantic powers are not restricted by our physical nature or the nature of our environment. That's a Platonic but not an Aristotelian attitude. And in the British empiricists, on the other hand, Hume, of course, has an easy way out. He can say, yes, when I think about it, Berkeley is right. When I think about it, if I thought about it, I would have to be a Berkeleyan idealist. But when I don't think about it, I ignore that. But Hume has what I would call a pictorial semantics. For Hume, ideas are pictures, and reference is simply a matter of resemblance. And part of the problem is many philosophers of an empiricist bent like Hume's conclusions, but they ignore the fact entirely that the conclusions are arrived at by appeal to a semantic theory, which is now bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
So we are, but you have this kind of opposition with Descartes. Imagine, of course, we can imagine. What we can imagine what we can conceive has nothing to do with what exists or being coupled, or how we're coupled to what exists. Mm-hmm. Semantic omnipotence. Hume, we are restricted to what we can picture. We can only conceive of what we can picture. And then here and there, Hume admits that doesn't quite work, but basically says we'll ignore that. But so the question of the range of our semantic powers goes back to the beginnings of philosophy, to Aristotle versus Plato, and I'm on the Aristotelian side here.
Mm-hmm. And very short last personal question, if you.
Okay.
In Wikipedia, it is said that you have played a small role in Mulholland Drive of David Lynch. Is it true?
Yeah, I'm sorry. A small role in what?
Small role in David Lynch movie Mulholland Drive. In Wikipedia, it is said about you. Is it true?
No, I don't know. I don't know the movie. What's the name of the movie?
But Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive. And it is
No.
said that you are a
But
friend.
but I am credited on the website of the Matrix.
Okay.
Okay. But maybe you say some words about your life. Do you live a philosophical life?
Do I live a philosophical life? Well, I live if I take my life as a whole, I would say I live I mean, not only because I was politically very active, sometimes wisely, sometimes unwisely, but I was a very staunch opponent of the Vietnam War in this country, and which I'm so proud of. But my life as a whole, and I guess I've been politically engaged for a long time, but my life as a whole, and I've got a marvelous wife and children, and that's a huge part of my life. But intellectually, I would say I lived a philosophical and mathematical life. I was lucky to have tried. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be a mathematician or a philosopher when I left college, and I was lucky enough in the end to be able to have both careers, which I regard as maybe the greatest blessing of my life. I think if I'm remembered in the future, say in 100 years, I'm probably much more likely to be remembered for my mathematical work than for my philosophical work, but that doesn't bother me.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you very much
for this wonderful interview, and we'll definitely send you a copy of this. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your time. I almost as I could reach across and put a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
We haven't got the technology perfected yet.
Yes,
But
yes.
probably soon. Probably soon.
Okay. До свидания.
До свидания. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.